Have you ever made a decision that seemed totally reasonable at the time, only to look back and wonder what you were thinking? This isn't a personal failing. It's the result of our brains taking shortcuts. These mental shortcuts are meant to help us make quick decisions, but when we're not aware of them, they can lead us down the wrong path. In this video, we're going to talk about 5 common cognitive biases that demonstrate the psychology behind bad decisions. It's no secret that humans don't always make the best calls. What might surprise you, though, is just how easily small, seemingly trivial details can influence the choices we make. Imagine you're at a new restaurant looking over the menu. The first thing you see is a $40 steak, which is more than you want to spend. You see a few other things on the menu that are more affordable, like a $22 pasta dish and a $25 burger. So you decide on the burger. It feels like a reasonable choice compared to the $40 steak. Now imagine you're at a different restaurant and the first thing you see on the menu is a $16 entree. Suddenly, that same $25 burger might seem overpriced. In this example, though, the burger didn't change, but your reference point did. When our brains stick to the first piece of information we learn and use this information to guide our judgments and decisions, it's called the anchoring bias. And it doesn't just affect our choices at a restaurant. For example, imagine you're going to meet a new coworker. Prior to the meeting, someone tells you that the new coworker seems standoffish. Because this is the first piece of information you learned about your new coworker, it's going to affect how you interpret their behavior. For example, when you meet them, if they're quiet, because you're anchored by this idea that they're standoffish, you're more likely to interpret their quietness as them being cold or unfriendly, when in reality they might just not be a talkative person. Now that you're aware of the anchoring bias, here are a few things you can do to ensure that you don't fall into this trap. First, you can identify multiple anchors. Instead of just using the first piece of information you see or hear, be intentional about seeking out other data points. Second, if possible, put off making a judgment or a decision until you have more information. Of course, that might not work when you're sitting at a restaurant and people are waiting for you to order. But when it comes to forming opinions about others or making larger decisions, waiting a bit so that you can collect more information will lead to a less biased decision. The next cognitive trap we're going to talk about is somewhat related to anchoring bias, but it differs in a few key ways. This trap is called the framing effect. Like the name implies, the framing effect occurs when our decisions are affected by how our options are presented to us. However, unlike the anchoring bias, where we become psychologically stuck on the first piece of information we encounter, the framing effect is more about how things are presented to us. For example, if a doctor tells you a surgery has a 90% survival rate, you'll process that differently than if you're told that there's a 10% mortality rate. In the example of the quiet coworker, when your colleague described them as standoffish, that was a particular framing. They could have easily described them as quiet or introverted, which would have led to you interpreting their behavior differently. In this example, the anchoring bias and framing effect are working together to lead us to the wrong judgment. The key difference with the framing effect is that it's not about what piece of information you get first. It's about how the information is presented or described to you. Another example of the framing effect is when you're selecting between, say, insurance plans. One plan might advertise that your home will be protected from unexpected emergencies and natural disasters. The other plan might say, without this plan, your home will be vulnerable to unexpected emergencies and natural disasters. In this example, the contents of either plan don't differ. What does differ, though, is how the plans are marketed to you. The best way to steer clear of the framing effect is to ensure that you're savvy to marketing and different ways of phrasing or presenting the same thing. Slowing down and asking ourselves, what is the actual information here versus what is framing or marketing? By reframing how things are presented to us in more neutral terms, we're better able to make rational, less emotionally driven decisions. The third cognitive bias on our list is the representativeness heuristic, which is deciding how likely something is by comparing it to what we think is a typical example. In the real world, this bias most often looks like applying stereotypes to other people. For example, if you see a physically fit person outside jogging, you might assume that they're at low risk for heart disease. But you don't know anything about their family history, their stress levels, what medications they're on, or really anything about them. So you can't really know what their risk for heart disease is. You're making a judgment based on a stereotyped belief. Or pretend you see an older man struggling with his phone. You might assume he's bad with technology, when in reality he's an engineer who's really good with technology. He just switched from an iPhone to an Android. So although you are seeing this person struggle with technology in the moment, the why and how of that struggle is not known to you. So your brain fills in the blanks based on stereotypes. The most effective way to overcome the representativeness heuristic is to simply ask ourselves what we're basing our judgments of others on. Would we be making the same judgment about the person if they were a different age, different race, different gender, and so on? Engaging in this self-reflection will help us better determine when we're making a judgment that's being informed by stereotypes versus actual information. The fourth cognitive trap on our list is base rate neglect, which is when we ignore general information in favor of specific details. A classic example of base rate neglect comes from slot machines. If a slot machine hasn't delivered a big payout in, say, a few hours, a person might think it's due for a win. However, this belief neglects the base rate, that slot machines use random probabilities and each spin is independent with the same odds regardless of previous outcomes. A similar example is a coin flip. If you flip a coin and get heads 8 times in a row, you might think you're due to flip a tails. But each coin flip has the same 50-50 probability regardless of the results that came before. A totally different example of base rate neglect often shows up in conversations about climate change. Someone might say, well, we've had a very cold winter, so climate change obviously isn't real, while ignoring the base rate that the average global temperature has been steadily rising over time, even though short-term weather patterns still show normal variability. For this cognitive bias, the solution truly is to focus on data versus our own individual observations, because our individual observations almost never reflect the larger trends that are observed in aggregate. The final cognitive trap we're going to discuss today is hindsight bias. You've probably heard the saying that hindsight is 20/20, meaning that when we look at something in retrospect, we feel like we knew all along what would happen. On the surface, this seems like a fairly innocuous cognitive bias, but it does have the potential to keep us locked into patterns that we're unconscious of, because when we fall prey to this bias, we become less likely to examine our own motivations and the factors that led up to the event. Say you performed poorly on an exam, and after you get your grade, you say, I knew I should have studied more. This belief that you should have just studied more can override the false confidence you felt the day before when you weren't studying. This, in turn, can lead you down the same cognitive trap in the future. In contrast, if you go back and examine how you prepared for the test and identify areas where you could have studied more or changed your approach, instead of just assuming you should have spent more time with the material, you're more likely to improve your studying skills in the future. Or say you're planning a vacation and someone tells you to bring an umbrella. You decide not to, but then it rains your whole vacation and you think, I really should have packed that umbrella. In this case, the psychological salience is placed on the emotional frustration versus the cognitive preparation piece, which is really where the focus should be if the goal is to learn from past mistakes. The best way to overcome the hindsight bias is to take an objective and non-judgmental look at what missteps we might have made that led us to the outcome we've achieved. Rather than shaming ourselves for ignoring our intuition or using this bias to retroactively explain a poor decision, the goal should be to look at our thoughts and behaviors and decide what among them contributed to the outcome we're facing so that we can learn from them in the future. You've just learned 5 common cognitive pitfalls that affect our judgment and decision making every day. Now that you're aware of them, you can use what you've learned to make less rash and more informed decisions. Try and see how many cognitive errors you can spot this week. Or even better, see if you can catch yourself in one and course correct. Believe it or not, these are just 5 of dozens of cognitive biases that have been observed in humans. Importantly, they're not mutually exclusive. As we saw with the anchoring bias and framing effect, these cognitive errors can compound, leading us down the wrong path even more expeditiously than we otherwise might have taken it. That's why developing awareness around these cognitive patterns can go a long way. You don't need to eliminate bias entirely, that would be impossible. However, by recognizing when your curious wiring is relying on these shortcuts, you can learn to slow down, ask better questions, and make decisions that are more intentional.